good evening, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us in the last of our series of webinars on surrogacy for 2020. I hope first and foremost that this finds you all safe and well and continue to be so as we here in the UK come out of lockdown. Just a little reminder that we are recording this, and so if everyone could just keep themselves on mute. If you do have a question or a comment, then please do make use of the little chat box, which you'll see in the middle of your screen. We've got someone who is going to be checking in on that, but I'll make sure that we allow time at the end of the speaker slot for us to just make sure that we've covered all of the questions that anyone has raised, or indeed any of the comments. So pop those in there at any point along the way, and I'll make sure that I check in on that after the speakers have covered what they're going to be talking about this evening. Brilliant Beginnings. My name is Helen Prosser. And I'm one of the co-owners of Brilliant Beginnings and NGA Law. And we've been helping people navigate through to parenthood for over 10 years now. And this year has really proved to be just so different than any of us could have ever imagined or anticipated. So we're very glad to get to this end of the year. We're even more delighted to be able to hopefully bring a little bit of light and good news that we see that's on the horizon to help you all with your thoughts as the coming season will naturally shift your thinking into families. Along with everyone in the world, we're very hopeful that life will begin to get back to normal in whatever guise that is over the next few months. And so this is certainly a really good time to be beginning to think and plan about opportunities around surrogacy. And we're here talking specifically about surrogacy in the US and the situation as it is beginning to unfold in the US now, but also on the backdrop of the experience that we have to date. I'm so delighted to have three really wonderful speakers to help guide you through that maze. All of them are both skilled in their professional lives, but also live and breathe surrogacy in their own personal lives. And so we're hoping that we will be able to cover every aspect of planning your surrogacy journey in the US and in particular in light of the current pandemic. So I'm not going to say any more, apart from I'd like to introduce our very first speaker, which is Stephen Ashe. Stephen is one of our client managers here at Brilliant Beginnings and is a father of 2 children born through surrogacy, which really gives him a very personal insight into surrogacy. Stephen is involved in every aspect of supporting our intended parents who go to the US to find their surrogate, and has responsibility not just for looking after the intended parents and the surrogates that they find, but also the professional partners that we work alongside with. He also supports our surrogate program and really is a passionate supporter and believer in our drive to change surrogacy law here in the UK. So I'm going to hand over to Stephen, who's going to give us a run through of some of the practicalities in going to the US for surrogacy. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Helen, and a really lovely introduction. Thank you very much. Really pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about surrogacy in the US. And as Helen said, I've got some professional experience working with Brilliant Beginnings and supporting our intended parents as they navigate the US and other destinations. But first and foremost, I am a dad to 2 through surrogacy myself, and I'm always feeling very privileged that not only have I been through that journey and have 2 wonderful children, but I now have the opportunity to share that experience, and personal experience really is invaluable in a surrogacy journey. When my partner and I started out thinking about surrogacy, I think we were really overwhelmed by the choice that was there. It was good in some respects in that there were options, but also very overwhelming as well. So I think the opportunity to think carefully about the different options and make your decisions before starting out is really key. Well, the good news is that there are possibilities even now during coronavirus and the pandemic. There are still ways to get started with surrogacy. And the US is a tried and tested route for surrogacy, and even now it is possible to get started and navigate successfully a surrogacy journey in the US. But it needs to be right for you. So hopefully today and this evening, I'll be able to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the practical sides of things. So the positives of the US are that, as I said, it's well established. Surrogacy has been operating in the US for a long time. That means that a lot of the people that you come into contact with in the US are going to be experienced and accepting of surrogacy, and that's really positive. The downside is that there is a lot of choice, and that does mean that navigating those decisions is quite difficult. But there are some key parts of the puzzle that you need to think about putting together from the very outset. So firstly, you need to think about the people that are going to support you on this journey. At Brilliant Beginnings, we help intended parents navigate some of those initial decisions and also support throughout, but you can also do that yourself as well. So the key parts of the puzzle are your surrogacy agency, and the surrogacy agency is going to be with you for the majority of the journey and from the very outset. But it's really key that you make some decisions about the right surrogacy agency, the one that's going to work best for you and what you're looking for. So there's things to think about there in terms of where do they operate? Do they recruit surrogates from a particular area of the US? Or are they looking quite broadly across the country? And sometimes if you as intended parents have links to a particular area in the US, it's worth sort of thinking about where your surrogate might be based. And one of the key things to think about there is that actually the majority of your surrogacy journey is going to be where your surrogate is based. So this is really a key decision when intended parents are thinking about geography, that it's where the surrogate is based that's really key there. Alongside that, the agencies, the good thing about the agencies is that they have robust screening and preparation processes that surrogates will go through, and the agencies will have strong vetting procedures, and they'll also be used to doing surrogacy and supporting those women through that journey. But that is quite specific to the different agencies, so it's worth, when you're thinking about the surrogacy agency that's going to help you, what specific things you'd be looking for in terms of the support and the screening process that the surrogate will go through. Some of the agencies, for example, have dietitians and pediatric nurses as part of their staff, and that can be a real reassurance for intended parents that are really keen to see that as part of the agency support. Alongside that, there's also the style of the agency, and that needs to fit with what you're looking for as well. Many intended parents like to have a communication that's fluid, but also feels very human and natural, whilst keeping them updated in a professional way. Others might be looking for more of a transactional approach and more methodical and a bit more structured. And the agencies will achieve that in different ways, and it's important to have a think about what you would be looking for as part of that. Another thing is to think about the match times for surrogates, because this can really vary between the agencies. So depending on your overall timescale, that's another thing to be talking to the agencies about and asking them what their current match times are for surrogates based on your circumstances. It's a good idea to also speak with them about their experience of helping international intended parents. Obviously, there are a huge number of surrogacy agencies in the US, but actually the number that deal and help with intended parents that live outside of the US are a bit more limited. So that's a really important question to be asking. Another key part of the puzzle is obviously the clinic, and we have an amazing clinic on board, one of the ones that we work with and signpost intended parents to, And there are other choices as well. And the key thing with the clinics is thinking about success rates, experience of surrogacy, if you need access to an egg donor program, whether they have one, and those sorts of questions. Alongside where the clinic is based, if you need to travel out to the clinic, then that's obviously part of your thinking. But actually going back to where the surrogate is based, that is the more important aspect of the geography to think about. You might also want to think about the clinic's ability to do additional testing, and whether they have programs that offer fixed packages and fixed fees around treatment, egg donation, testing. So that's a key thing to think about. The final part of the puzzle for intended parents is to identify a US attorney that's going to help them with their surrogacy journey. So a US attorney will fit in around bringing together an agreement with your surrogate. They'll also look to draft an egg donor agreement if that's needed as well. But crucially, they're also going to be helping you with your parentage when your baby is born. And in the USA, surrogacy is dealt with on a state-by-state basis. So although the majority of states are very accepting and surrogacy is permitted and legal, there are some differences between the states. So that is key to have a think about as well. Alongside all of those different aspects of the different parts of that puzzle, you also want to think about the experience that the organizations have had working with each other. As much as possible, you want to be making sure that you're having a set of organizations that are not only used to dealing and helping intended parents that live outside of the US, but also they're used to communicating with each other as well. That can really help to make for a very, very good journey. Talking about timings, once you've sort of thought about the different organizations at the outset, it's also worth thinking about when you start things going with each of them. And what we see when we're helping intended parents establish in the US is that the best thing to do if they need to create embryos is to establish with a surrogacy agency at the same time. And those two things can go along in tandem. And Dr. Jeff will be talking about how to think about creating embryos shortly, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But the key thing to take away there is that that's going to take some time. And actually, whilst you're getting that sorted and identifying an egg donor, there's time when the agency can be looking for a surrogate for you. And the two things can happen in tandem. And the idea is that towards the end of when you've created embryos, the surrogacy agency should be thinking about, okay, well, now's a really good time to be looking at a match. So just a little bit about the matching process, because that's another thing to sort of have a think about and what you'd be looking for in that as an intended parent. I know personally, I wanted to make sure that I had lots of information. And the good thing is that the US agencies are very good at providing a lot of information, but it does vary again between the different agencies. So it's worth having a little think and discussion with them about that. It's common for you as an intended parent to have a couple of profiles, or potentially just one to focus on that the agency thinks would be a good match. And you'll have an opportunity to review the profile, get a little bit of a sense for the surrogate and her family, which is really lovely to be able to see what's brought her to surrogacy, her family background, where she lives, and some photos. When you go back to the agency and had a chance to have a look through the profile, you will then most likely be invited to go along to a match call, which is often held on Zoom or sometimes on an audio call. And that's really an opportunity for you to have a conversation with a surrogate and her family and her partner, and get a sense for them as people, because up until that point you really have just been looking at a piece of paper, and it's not until that call that it really becomes real. When you've had that and you decided to move forward, the job of the surrogacy agency is really to support communication and facilitate that with a view to the next stages of the surrogate undergoing treatment at your clinic and medical screening, and then for your US attorney to finalise the surrogacy agreement before treatment actually commences with a view to an embryo transfer. Now, during the pregnancy, this is where it's obviously a lot more difficult for international intended parents, because it would be commonplace in the UK to be quite involved in the surrogacy pregnancy. But the distance between the UK and the US means that that is quite difficult. And particularly now in relation to the pandemic, we used to see that during a pregnancy, the intended parents would potentially travel out for embryo transfer or early on in the pregnancy to meet with the surrogate. And then again, around 20 weeks, halfway through the pregnancy, when there's really key scans around the anatomy scan. The really lovely part of that is that intended parents were able to visit surrogates where they live, get a little bit of a sense of the area where ultimately their baby is going to be born. So although that's not possible right at this moment, there are other ways around that, and everybody has embraced video calling and Skyping and Zooming. So there are still plenty of opportunities now to get to know the surrogate. Hopefully, if the hospital is on board with you Skyping or Zooming into scans and things, that's also possible. So there is no lack of opportunities to establish that relationship and still communicate quite effectively during the pregnancy. It's just the physical attendance in the US that's a little bit difficult at the moment. Towards the end of the pregnancy, what your surrogacy agency will be encouraging you to do is to finalise a birth plan at the hospital where the surrogate is going to be giving birth, and really make sure that that is all set up properly and ready to go in anticipation of baby's arrival. Now, the good news is that even, and Natalie will talk to this a little bit more later on the legal side, but it is still possible, and there are established routes even now for intended parents to be able to get out to the US for baby's arrival, and in good time as well. And so far, touch wood, we haven't had any intended parents that have not been able to get out for the birth of baby. At the delivery, you want to be making sure, as I said, that you're in the US for at least a few weeks beforehand. That'll give you an opportunity to find your feet, get settled into wherever you're staying, because you're likely to be there for a little bit of time. You want to make sure that you know where the local Walmart is, so that you know where you can get formula and nappies if you need to, or where the nearest fast food fix is for that. When baby arrives, you're also going to be anticipating a little bit of a stay whilst you wait for the legal parentage side of things to go through, and also apply for the US passport, which ultimately you're going to be traveling back on. Now, it's worth pointing out around the budget, because that is possibly one of the downsides of the US, in that the costs are relatively high, certainly in comparison to a UK surrogacy journey. So it's worth just breaking down a little bit around that. We often see that the range in the budget, and it is very difficult to give a set budget for any intended parent, because circumstances are so different. But we see a range of anywhere from 100,000 really at the lower end, £100,000, up to £220,000 when you're talking about multiple transfers and potentially conceiving twins. To break that down, and I would say, just to give an average ballpark, that £160,000 to £180,000 is not is pretty average, although there's some ability to work around that. And one of the things that we do with intended parents when they come to us for help is really work out what their budget is likely to be, and where we might need to make sure that there's specific things happening at different points of the journey, particularly at the beginning, where there's an opportunity to really think about the costs and focus the journey in a way that means that that's going to be as achievable as possible. Just to break it down briefly in terms of the costs. So firstly, if you're having help from Brilliant Beginnings to set up, then there's those costs. In the US, there's going to be surrogacy agency fees. And that will be for finding the surrogate, but also if you're using and have the help of a third-party egg donor agency as well, there might be fees around that. There's surrogate compensation, and in addition to compensation, the surrogate will also receive expenses as well. So those are things to think about. The egg donor, if you're having the help of an egg donor, you'll need to think about compensation for her as well. The clinics often have egg donor programs as well, and that's a good way of reducing costs around that. There are the clinic costs, which the doctor will talk about shortly. There's the US legal costs, which spoke about the US attorney helping you through different parts of that. There's your UK legal costs, and Natalie will speak to the fact that actually when you come home, you're going to be looking to apply for the parental order, and there's going to be some costs around that, depending on the level of help that you want. Other parts of the costs include insurance, so you're looking at surrogate insurance, but also around care for your baby when baby arrives as well, and whether that's insurance that you want to take out specifically for your baby or whether you negotiate with the hospital directly. And there are some organisations that can help with that. And finally, your travel and accommodation. Now, obviously, at the moment, travel is very restricted, but should things start to open up and you have the opportunity to travel out a little bit more, then you need to factor that in as well. And often if intended parents have family or friends that they can call upon to go and visit, then that can be very helpful as well. And that might be something to think about at the very beginning when you're establishing what agency you have help you find your surrogate. Overall, the US offers a really, really good choice for surrogacy. There are some really good organisations that can support intended parents properly. And from our perspective, we see that surrogacy happens in an ethical way, and intended parents have a lot of choice, which is key. There is legal certainty, but there is the downside of the costs, and for some that's prohibitive, but there are some positives as well. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an overview of the US in general terms, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen. Very thorough. And just a little reminder, if you've got questions for Stephen, then pop them in the chat box. We have had some questions that somebody has sent through earlier, so I'll check in with those, but very thorough. Thank you, Stephen. So let's move on to the clinic stage, and I'd really love to introduce you to Dr. Jeff, who is Medical Director at American Fertility Services, which is based in Connecticut on the East Coast. Dr. Jeff is recognized as expert in third-party reproduction and works with people all over the world. And we've worked alongside Dr. Jeff for a little while now. And really the care and attention, I think, is one of the things that stands out to us. Dr. Jeff's ethos is very much about making sure that his clients and patients have a really clear understanding of what they're embarking on, and so are able to make the decisions that they need to make when they need to make them with the right information and knowledge. Dr. Jeff completed his residency in obstetrics and gynecology at New York Presbyterian Columbia University, where he also held a fellowship in reproductive endocrinology and infertility. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Jeff, and I'm sure he will be able to outline just how it all works and how he does his magic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and it's really a great pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to have this joint informational webinar session with Brilliant Beginnings. As Stephen mentioned earlier, I think indeed this journey experience often, can be complicated. It involves, different parties and groups coming together and working as a team to help fulfill your dream. So certainly our philosophy is to be a part of your team, to facilitate the communication and to help bring all the parties together during the medical treatment. Let me go ahead and start talking about the parts of the medical aspects of the treatment. In terms of preparing for your journey, there are, I think sometimes we can kind of simplify things to about three parts from a medical or biological perspective. One part is the sperm, and the other part is the egg. We need both to combine together to create embryos. And of course, the third part of our journey is the gestational carrier, who can be kind and helpful and help us carry the embryos that we've created to deliver healthy full-term babies. So starting from the sperm side, I think it's important for all intended fathers to at least have a general semen analysis just to make sure that the sperm count, motility, everything looks good so that we don't have any surprises. And following that, we usually, prior to COVID, would invite the intended fathers to come to our clinic for just a quick half-day visit where we would do a semen analysis, freeze the sperm sample, perform the FDA-required infectious disease screening, as well as performing a genetic screening. And that really would be the only visit that you would need from a medical perspective. Following that, you can work with either a clinic or egg donation agency to find an egg donor whom you feel comfortable working with. Once that's done, then the clinic can help to create the embryos and take care of the egg donors through her stimulation and egg retrieval process. At the end of that, we would freeze the embryos and we would do the chromosome testing of the embryos, and that would conclude, I would say, the first half of the journey of the embryo creation. Second half after that, you will work with a surrogacy agency to find a suitable gestational carrier, and we would help you with the screening and the record review process. Once that's done, the screening is completed, then we'll go through the legal phase like Stephen mentioned, and once we have the legal clearance, then we'll proceed with the embryo transfer. We'll kind of next up talk a little bit about the different parts, and let's first go and look at the egg donation portion a little bit more for those intended parents who actually will need an egg donor. Generally speaking, we recommend working with egg donors between the ages of 21 to 31. As we age, the number of eggs as well as the quality of the eggs naturally will decline. So typically, 21 to 31 is the optimal recommended age for egg donors. They should be healthy. We usually recommend a body mass index between 19 to about 28. They should have healthy habits. They shouldn't smoke, have drug abuse problems, or abuse alcohol. So these are our general expectation for an egg donor. They need to go through psychological evaluation by a professional licensed social worker or psychologist to determine and make sure that their motivation for egg donation is appropriate, as well as to identify any potential psychological conditions in the donor or in her family history that might preclude her from becoming a donor. In terms of the next set of screening, we usually would like to assess what we call egg reserve or ovarian reserve. Young women between the age of 21 to 31 can have a diverse and wide range of number of eggs. And we can't always assume that an egg donor between the ages of 21 to 31 naturally would have a sufficient number of eggs for us to work with. So we rely on two main tests. One is a sonogram, where we actually visualize the small, what we call follicles in the ovaries, because the eggs reside inside the follicles. When we do a follicle count on the sonogram, essentially we're estimating the number of eggs that will be available during the egg donation treatment. These follicles also release a hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone, or AMH, and this is a simple blood test that we use. The more eggs we have, the higher the AMH level, and in reverse, the lower egg supply we have, the closer the AMH level approaches zero. So we usually use the follicle count and the AMH levels together to help guide the egg donor as well as to inform the intended parents in terms of what we expect from the egg donation cycle under stimulation and for the retrieval. Other than egg reserve, we also recommend doing genetic testing for the egg donor, similar to the intended fathers. About 25% of us are carrying some type of mutation without any symptoms. So this is very common. But for the purpose of creating embryos, it's important for us to make sure that the intended father and the egg donor do not share any common mutations. And that's the purpose of the genetic screening. So if we identify egg donors and intended fathers sharing the same mutation, our usual recommendation would be to search for another egg donor. After the genetic testing, we also need to do infectious disease screening. In the US, the FDA, Food Drug Administration, tightly and heavily regulates tissue donation. Although we often don't think about transferring an embryo into a gestational carrier as tissue donation, as similar, we would think about transplanting a heart or a kidney. However, when we put tissue, even as small as an embryo, into another person, this carries a potential risk of transmitting infectious disease. And so egg donors have to go through a very comprehensive and thorough process, testing for HIV, hepatitis B, C, gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis, West Nile virus. They have to do a physical exam and fill out a very extensive questionnaire that follows the FDA guideline. And in fact, we use the same type of screening method for the intended father as well, because from a sperm perspective, when we transfer an embryo into a gestational carrier, that is also viewed as tissue donation. So an egg donor has to go through a very vigorous screening process and pass all of them in order to become an egg donor. Next, we'll shift gear a little bit and we'll talk a little bit about the screening process for the gestational surrogate. Stephen mentioned, on the front end, you usually will start the process by working with the surrogacy agency, who will provide you with profiles. Usually the information is provided by the surrogate herself. Once there is a potential match, the surrogacy agency will reach out to the clinic, and they will forward us all of the prior obstetrical and delivery records, often just hundreds and hundreds of pages of records that we go through page by page. I find that to be a very important part of the screening process, because sometimes in a self-provided information in the questionnaire, there may be things that were forgotten or not mentioned. So we do have to verify, make sure all the records that the surrogate provided is actually correct and matches all the past delivery records. After that, we would ask the agency to help the surrogate set up a psychological evaluation. She would also need to meet with her OBGYN to make sure that her obstetrician agrees that she can proceed as gestational carrier. And once we have all the approval, then we would invite the gestational carrier to our clinic for in-person interview as well as additional testing. As Stephen said, a lot of times when you're reading profile, it's really just a piece of paper, and we find that meeting the surrogate in person, sometimes you do find things, that may not be, readily identified on the application. So we do think that under ideal circumstances, having an in-person visit would be more ideal. During that visit, the surrogate would have infectious disease blood tests done, drug screen, nicotine screen. We would do a detailed sonogram to make sure that her uterus is in optimal condition. We rule out conditions such as fibroids, polyps, or scar tissue that may potentially interfere with the embryo implantation process. Once we complete that screening that day, we would share the results with the intended parents, with the agency, let everyone know that the medical screening has been completed. And for most agencies, that's when they proceed with the final drafting and reviewing of the contract for the legal clearance. During that time, the clinic is just on standby, and as soon as we receive the legal clearance to proceed, we will then reach back out to the gestational carrier to help her prepare for the final process, which is the embryo transfer. The gestational carrier usually will need about 2 to 3 weeks of estrogen medication. This helps to prepare the uterus, build up a nice layer of tissue that we call endometrium. She would then go for ultrasound exam to make sure that the uterus is in optimal condition. Then we would add in another medication called progesterone, which helps to prepare the uterus, the endometrium, to receive the embryo. And after about 5 days of progesterone, the surrogate would then come to our office, and we will thaw the embryo that were previously frozen, and then we would perform the embryo transfer, which is a very straightforward, simple procedure that usually takes about 5 minutes to complete. After the transfer, the gestational carrier usually stays in our area. If she's from other states, she will stay in in the vicinity for an extra day. Then after that, she will go home. Somewhere around 10 to 12 days after the embryo transfer, we will be able to do a blood test just to, confirm whether the embryo has implanted or not, and hopefully share good news with you. In general, that's the medical aspect of the treatment, from preparing for the intended fathers to prepare for potentially working with the egg donor to the gestational carrier transfer. At the end of the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to share it with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You make it sound so easy. Magic wand. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Finally, let's move on to the legal aspect of your surrogacy journey in the US, and I'm really pleased to bring on Natalie. Natalie Gamble is my business partner, and more importantly is known internationally as the UK's leading fertility lawyer. She and the team at NGA Law have enabled so much of the needed change that we have here as far as the UK legal system is concerned. She's campaigned for many, many years for same-sex parents as well as fertility patients. She's won key legal changes on surrogacy and donation, both within Parliament and in the High Court. And she's represented the parents in virtually all the key court cases that have shaped the UK law on international surrogacy. You'll often see her in the media. She's been quoted in Parliament. There isn't really very much that she doesn't know. So she's going to give us a potted version on how the legals work, but I know as well as happy to answer questions. Thank you, Natalie.
Brilliant, thank you. Gosh, that sounds like a really scary resume for an introduction, but it's lovely to be here and welcome everybody. And as Helen says, we're really passionate about kind of finding solutions to things and kind of campaigning to make the law better and more practical for parents who are trying to conceive families in different ways. So I'm going to talk to you about kind of the legal issues at each stage of a US surrogacy journey, but in particular, some of that is a bit of a story of the journey we've had this year and some of the solutions that we've had to find to new problems that weren't an issue before COVID-19. So first of all, the kind of first step in the journey, as we've been talking about, is about kind of creating your embryos, which will be transferred to your surrogate in the US. And historically, it's been very straightforward for parents from the UK to travel to the US in order to leave sperm to be combined with eggs from a donor if they were using an egg donor, or to go to the US to go through a cycle of IVF treatment if they were using their own embryo with their own gametes. But in February, President Trump issued a travel ban on anybody who was traveling from Europe to the US. And that has stopped parents being able to travel out physically to the US in order to go through those medical treatment processes. Now, we've had a number of parents over the course of this year that have nonetheless wanted to proceed with surrogacy journeys in the US. And so we've been trying to work through solutions whereby parents could deposit sperm or create embryos at fertility clinics here in the UK, and then ask the fertility clinic to transport the embryos or the genetic material out to the US to avoid the need for them to themselves personally go. Now, there was previously a bit of an obstacle to this because the HFEA, which is the regulator of fertility clinics here in the UK, previously said that fertility clinics were not supposed to export material for the purposes of surrogacy overseas if the surrogacy arrangement was a commercial one. Now, I won't go into all the detail of why that's an issue, but there's some kind of technical legal reasons why that wasn't quite the right interpretation of the law. So Brilliant Beginnings and NGA Law, we have challenged that reading of what the rules say. And we tried to do it in a very constructive way and in collaboration with the HFEA. So we wrote to them and explained why we thought that their guidance was wrong. And I'm very pleased to tell you that they wrote back to us in the last few weeks to say that they now agree with us and that they will be updating their guidance to make it clear that fertility clinics can export for the purposes of surrogacy overseas, and that it's irrelevant whether the surrogacy is commercial. So we are, really hoping that that will smooth the path. There have been some fertility clinics that have been willing to export it even under the current guidance, but this will certainly make things easier. So if you're looking at going to the US for surrogacy and thinking, well, I'm here in lockdown, it may be ending tomorrow, but how on earth am I actually going to make this happen? The way to do it right now, and until kind of travel starts opening up again, which we sort of hope and anticipate it will during the course of next year, then the way to do it is to find a UK partner clinic that can work well with your clinic in the US, so that you can, arrange the bits you need to do here, but then enable your material to be sent to the US so that you can conceive. So that's the first step in the journey, if you like, in order to get things going. And the other parts, the early parts of the process, so working with your agency, being matched with your surrogate and so on, are all things that can be done remotely. So this is kind of enabling you to get going. As Stephen was explaining, on the legal side, there will then be a process to go through at the beginning of the process at the US end. So your US attorney will help you with putting in place a contract with your surrogate, and that will be legally recognized in the US. So the specifics of how that works will vary according to the state in which your surrogate lives. So you may need to make a court application during the pregnancy or shortly after the birth, or you may need to file some documentation with the local Department of Health, but your attorney will advise you on the specifics of what you need to do. And the object of that legal process is that when your baby is born, you will be recognised as the legal parent or legal parents immediately, and you will be registered on the birth certificate in the US as such. So one of the big attractions for parents from the UK going to the US for surrogacy is that you have that legal certainty. You don't have that anxiety about the surrogate needing to give up her status as the mother after the birth, which is how things work here in the UK. But from a UK perspective, unfortunately, the law doesn't automatically recognise the position in the US. So there are some additional steps that you'll need to go through in order to make sure that your position as a family is totally secure at the UK end as well. So I'll talk through those in a minute. But just to kind of go through the kind of the next step in the journey, obviously these travel restrictions that I was talking about have also been affecting parents who've wanted to travel out to the US to be present when their child is born. So you can deal with, during the pregnancy, having that relationship with your surrogate remotely. Sadly, we're having to do that with, family members and everyone at the moment. But it's certainly possible to do that with your surrogate. But in terms of the birth, parents obviously want to be there at the birth of their child and need to be there because they're legally responsible for their baby when the baby is born. But fortunately, there are some exemptions to that travel ban that otherwise stop parents traveling from the UK. And one of those exemptions is that it's in the national interest of the US for you to be allowed to travel. Now, fortunately, for any of you kind of watching this who are at an early stage of the journey, you'll be glad to know that lots of other parents have trodden this path before you. So in the early days, March and April, we didn't quite know whether parents were going to fit within this exemption and how things would work. But we've now had 9 months of parents being given permission to travel. And as Stephen says, there isn't anybody that we've been working with that hasn't been able to get there. So you need to do a bit of planning. Things may well change in the months ahead. Hopefully with the coming of a vaccine, things could look very different. But for the time being, if you're expecting a baby in the next couple of months, then it is possible to get permission to travel. You just need to plan a few months ahead of the birth to request that so that you're able to fly. So we can get you into the US, you can be there when your baby is born. The next step is then going to be about coming home again and getting the right documentation so that your child can travel with you back to the UK, or to wherever you live if you're British but you don't live in the UK. Now, traditionally, most parents through surrogacy have applied for an American passport for their baby because any child born on US soil is automatically an American citizen, and the process of applying for a US passport is very straightforward. So in normal times, you can make an appointment, a same-day appointment to go and collect your US passport once you've got your child's US birth certificate. What's happened in the last 9 months is that some of those services for issuing US passports have been restricted because of lockdown restrictions and so on. So it was only possible in March and April to apply for a US passport by post. And that was something that at the time was taking many months. And so we had a number of parents who found themselves kind of suddenly stranded in the US in April, where their baby had been born, they'd got to the US, they had expected to get a US passport and come home quickly. Suddenly they were in the middle of a pandemic, you know, possibly without health insurance coverage for themselves, wanting to get home very quickly, quite worried, and suddenly not being able to get this US passport that they were planning to get. So we did some lobbying work where we worked with the media. We were in The Guardian on the Today programme. We wrote to the Home Secretary and the government, I think, responding to some of the press and the fuss that was going on, and some of our clients that, you know, were lobbying and getting their MPs involved as well, were really helpful and really supportive. And they nominated somebody at the Home Office who's a really good contact, who's really helped to kind of smooth the process of getting a UK passport much more quickly than was previously possible. So in the past, where it would have taken several months to get a UK passport, we were suddenly able to get emergency passports within, I think in our first case, it took 7 days. So very, very quickly. And, you know, that's a process that we have been able to rely on in the absence of US passports. But the good news is that within the last few weeks, the US Passport Service has started reopening again to those expedited applications. So we're now just starting to see parents shifting back to using the US passport route because it's more straightforward if it's available, and then dealing with the UK passport at the other end. So the good news, I guess, is that the normal way of doing things is to get the US passport. That will bring you home within a couple of weeks of the birth. If for any reason, such as a global pandemic that you weren't anticipating, you suddenly find yourself unable to get that US passport, there is a backup. And now we've got this emergency passport route when it's needed. I think it will stay to some extent. So when we need to rely on it, we can. So you're not going to get stuck in the US, we can get you home. And then the last piece of the puzzle is the legal process that you go through here in the UK in order to become your child's legal parents. So there is a particular court order here called a parental order, and that is the order that intended parents through surrogacy are expected to apply for. And what the parental order does is it reassigns parenthood away from your surrogate, and if she's married, her spouse, and it makes you the legal parents under UK law as well as under US law. So at the end of the process, the court will send a copy of the order to the General Register Office, and your child will be issued with a UK birth certificate which confirms that you are the parents. So this is the bit that follows right at the end of the process. But what we do with the clients that we work with, and particularly if you're working with Brilliant Beginnings, to make sure that you're kind of following each step all the way through and that you don't miss anything, is to make sure that you have legal advice right at the beginning so that you understand how that process works. You know, we make sure that you do qualify for that order, or if you don't qualify for that order, we make sure that there's another legal plan and another way of resolving things. And there's a lot to say about the parental order, which we can talk to you about individually if you're following a journey, but I'm just going to kind of touch on some of the highlights. So essentially it involves a court application which is heard by a High Court judge. The process takes between 4 and 12 months, depending on the level of legal support that you have with running that process. We've been doing hundreds of these applications now for many years, so we're very kind of efficient in terms of managing the court so that you have fewer court hearings and get through the process as quickly as possible. The court will assess your application against a number of criteria. Now, the most important of those is the welfare of your child. Now, clearly, this is a child you've chosen to conceive, you know, may have wanted for a very long time, and there's not a kind of very active assessment going on here in terms of welfare, but the court just does need to see that it's the right order for your child. And you will also then need to show that you satisfy all the various criteria. So just very briefly, and I'm not going to run through all of these, the most important ones are you have to have a biological connection with your child. So you can use an egg donor or a sperm donor, but you can't apply for a parental order if you don't have a genetic connection on either side. You have to show that you, or at least one of you, if you're a couple, is domiciled in the UK. That can be more complicated if you were born outside the UK and you've settled here, or if you're British and you're living overseas. So it's important to get advice on that. Your surrogate needs to consent to the parental order being granted, and that's something that she would agree to after the birth. So an important part of the process, but not one we've ever seen be a difficulty in a US surrogacy case. And then in relation to the payments that you make, it's not illegal for parents from the UK to engage in commercial surrogacy overseas, but you will need to ask the court to authorise the payments that you've made that go beyond your surrogate's expenses. So you'll need to provide a breakdown of what you've paid, and also give some background to the court to show that everything's been done ethically, that nobody's been taken advantage of. And this is very, very well tested now, and US cases are certainly seen as the better regulated cases, and the cases where there are much less concerns about imbalance of power or ethics compared with other international surrogacy destinations. So all of these issues are things that the court is very used to dealing with, and it's really just a question for you as parents of being well armed so that you're giving the judge all the tools to be able to make a quick decision and make this as easy as possible for them. So in terms of the process and how it's working at the moment, the family court, like everyone else, has had to adapt to remote working. So we're now having court hearings on Microsoft Teams and by Skype, which is fantastic for some parents, particularly those who live overseas. I did a final hearing the other day with the parents in 2 different parts of Asia, and me at home, and the judge in her living room, and the clerk in London. So it's all very international, and certainly much more convenient for those sorts of parents than when they had to kind of travel back to the UK for the hearings. So that's possible, but who knows what will happen kind of post-COVID, whether that will continue. There's another part of the process, which is that a social worker who's appointed by the court will write a report for the judge, and usually they would come and visit you at home in order to prepare that report. At the moment, they're also doing their visits by FaceTime and Zoom, so you'll have to give them a little video tour of your home and have a chat with them over a cup of tea on a video screen. But the process is certainly not being held up by the fact that people are not able to do things in person. And generally speaking, the timescales are very similar to what they are in normal times. The bit of the process that seems to be a bit sticky and taking a bit more time is right at the end, getting the paper order out of the court and then getting the birth certificates registered is taking quite a bit longer than it was previously. But hopefully that will go back to normal at some stage in due course. So I think kind of the main message is that it has been a challenging year. We've had lots of kind of different issues to deal with. But for any of you who are at an early stage of your journey, other parents have been thrown into resolving these problems. So there is now kind of a very clear process at each step to make sure that this is very possible for you to do. And I think we're all looking forward to a much easier 2021. But even so, we've kind of managed to find ways through things. So it's certainly very possible to build a family through surrogacy in the US. And that's all I had to say, but like everyone else, I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Natalie. And just to sort of wrap that side of things up, if you are at the early stages, then of course the team at Brilliant Beginnings and NGA Law and Dr. Jeff's team are available if anybody needs some bespoke information, a bit of time, sometimes sitting down, mapping out the pros and cons and practicalities in terms of how it might work for you is useful. We, through Brilliant Beginnings, offer an options review meeting on the legal side to help you work through the legal aspects, a legal review meeting that essentially will just help you clear the road in terms of your thinking around that. And from there, if you are thinking of a journey to the US, then the team at Brilliant Beginnings have certainly got lots of experience in helping pull those pieces of the puzzle together and working alongside the team at AFS, to help you get started, get your material over to the US, and certainly very happy to talk to anybody about that. I mean, it really is just very much about planning and thinking ahead. And the really good news is that it just does feel that although it isn't as straightforward as it was this time last year, things are opening up, and certainly, as Natalie has said, that the route has already been trodden through for many others. So this is a good time to be thinking about it. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm just going to check through to just make sure. One of the questions, Natalie, is there any risk that intended parents would not have the right to be a legal parent as a result of surrogacy in the US?
Generally speaking, no. I mean, we've certainly never had a case where a parental order has been refused. The only caveat to that is that, you know, you do need to take care to make sure that you understand all the legal issues. So there have been a couple of cases that have been refused where parents haven't been domiciled in the UK. So if you're not eligible because, you know, you don't have sufficient connection with the UK, then that's something that could provide a block. That's quite rare. And in those cases where the court hasn't been able to make an order, what they will do is then look for the next best solution. So the court is not looking to kind of take your child away or anything like that. They're kind of saying, well, what's the best order that the court can make in order to ratify the reality that this is a family and this is what exists. So there's never been a case where the court has sought to remove a child on welfare grounds. And, you know, I think to do that, you would have to be at the threshold of a child being removed as from any other family. So there would have to be a significant concern about a significant risk of harm. So we're talking about very extreme cases. So for, you know, the overwhelming majority of parents, it is something that a lot of parents worry about, but you really don't need to.
Okay. Thank you. There's a couple of other legal questions that I'm just going to loop to you, Natalie. One that's just come up in the chat room. Has there been any issues with the UK border control when arriving with a baby without a UK passport?
No, so I mean, technically you are supposed to have the right documentation to enter the UK. So we're relying on the kind of goodwill of border control and admitting children if they turn up with just a US passport. But we've had hundreds of cases and we've never had any parents who were turned away. What we do see from time to time is that parents may have a bit of a challenging kind of conversation at the border and ask to justify themselves. So I think it's worth being prepared, carrying the right documents with you. And I think the most important thing is to kind of show that you are taking steps once you get home to apply for your parental order, apply for your UK passport, and that you're aware that there's stuff that needs to be done. So the only cases where, you know, it's got uncomfortable for parents is when, you know, they've not been prepared or they've been themselves confrontational and difficult with the border officer. So as long as you're polite and respectful and you are well prepared, you will be fine.
Wonderful. Thank you. And another legal question around the parental order, if you're based in Scotland rather than England, and how that would work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because you can choose essentially to apply either to the Scottish court or to the English court. But interestingly, all the Scottish parents that we've worked with have chosen to apply to the English court because the Scottish court has no published decision. So there's very little, you know, any judge you go to in Scotland would have no experience of international surrogacy, whereas the English court is dealing with about 300 cases per year. So it's very experienced and very used to dealing with these issues. But the more this happens, the more it becomes entrenched that there aren't any Scottish decisions because everyone's applying in England. So you've got the option, and I think it's a strategic decision about kind of where you want to apply.
Wonderful. Okay, a couple more legal questions. It's around entitlement for single parents to be off work and potentially, you know, anybody else really as well.
Yeah, so essentially parents through surrogacy who intend to apply for a parental order are entitled to adoption leave. So that gives the equivalent rights to maternity leave and pay. So essentially a year off work and then either the kind of statutory pay or whatever kind of pay you have through your employment contract, which may be better than that. And if you're a couple, you can choose which of you takes that leave. If you're a single parent, then you would take that leave. But that does rely on you being employed rather than self-employed.
Wonderful. Okay. Just checking really quickly. I think that is all the sort of legal-based questions. Another question for you, Stephen, and possibly Dr. Jeff as well. So if a surrogate miscarries, do things on a financial basis start right from the beginning again?
So the simple answer is no, but actually there's quite a lot in there that will depend on a number of things. One of the costs is around creating embryos. So if you have embryos still frozen, then that means that they can just be thawed as needed. So there's not extra costs. The only extra cost would potentially be around transfer. But there is also considerations around the compensation that the surrogate has already been paid, and that's not going to be, depending on when she miscarries, that's not going to be something that's going to come back to you. So potentially the further down the line, sadly, that she is when she miscarries means that that compensation would have been paid. But yeah, simple answer, no, you certainly wouldn't go straight back to the beginning. And if you're having the help of an egg donor and have a number of embryos, then that's really helpful to sort of bring the costs down around that. And it's not uncommon, just to say, in terms of the number of transfers, certainly early miscarriages are reasonably common, and we would expect sort of 2 to 3 transfers to achieve a pregnancy. So and that would be either that the embryo doesn't successfully implant, or it's a very early miscarriage, it doesn't get to the point where a heartbeat is picked up.
Great. Dr. Jeff, is there anything else to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer, Stephen. You know, even though we do go through the chromosome testing for the embryos to really try to identify the best quality embryo for each transfer, you know, fortunately, because of the limitations of science and medicine, you know, I would say somewhere between 5 to 10% of gestational carriers who are initially pregnant with a blood test may end up miscarrying, you know, even with chromosomally normal embryos. And so this is indeed a good, you know, discussion. While we hope that this never happens, but it's good to kind of plan ahead and think about what are the ramifications. And, you know, with egg donors, I would say typically on average, we probably generate somewhere between 6 to 10 chromosomally normal embryos to work with, you know, sometimes even more depending on the donor. So hopefully you wouldn't need to start all over again. And you could just use the embryos that have been frozen for subsequent transfers. You know, it's a little bit different sometimes. Some of our patients are autologous patients who are, you know, maybe 42, 43. They may have gone through, you know, 3 IVF cycles just to generate 1 chromosomally normal embryo because of their age. And of course, in those circumstances, if that embryo doesn't implant or miscarries, we do have to start all over again. But these are less common situations that, you know, we encounter.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, there was a general question around miscarriage and the rate for that, but I think you've probably covered that, which is really helpful. Just looking to make sure that we've had a few questions coming in. I want to make sure we've covered one final question, which I think you've all kind of alluded to individually. And it's just in terms of how long a surrogacy journey in the US is likely to take, start to finish. And I guess looking at it right from, you know, the get-go to bringing baby home and the parental order. Yes, maybe Stephen, is that for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's lots of variables involved, but I think if you have 18 to 24 months in mind, then that's not unrealistic. And certainly in terms of the current timescales, even with coronavirus, what we're seeing is even on our UK side with surrogates continuing to inquire, which means that the surrogacy agencies have lots of women interested in becoming surrogates even now. So the match times for surrogates have not really changed from what they were earlier in the year or last year. And you'd be looking at probably 4 to 6 months on average from the moment that you make contact with the surrogacy agency in the US to being matched with the surrogate. And in that time, as I said earlier, you would be looking to do the embryo creation side of things at the same time. So potentially you could be looking at your first embryo transfer in 6 to 8 months from starting things off in the US. Then there's obviously some big variables over whether the embryo is successful on the first transfer, whether it takes a couple of tries. So there's a couple of things to bear in mind there.
Wonderful. I'm just checking that we have no more questions. Wonderful. Well, thank you all very, very much for really insightful, really thorough. Just in closing, I wanted to just say thank you to Dr. Jeff for joining us from the middle of his day. I appreciate you taking time out of your clinic to be with us this evening. I know you and your team are always very happy to offer complimentary consultations if anyone is interested. We'll certainly put Dr. Jeff's details. We'll send a follow-up email with everybody's contact details. So by all means, you know, do let us know if there's any specific questions that we can pass on. It just leaves me to say, you know, look after yourselves. We are very much keeping more than just our fingers crossed for a very positive and very family-focused 2021, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and take care. Thank you to the speakers very, very much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.